Hey everyone, my name is Chip Gibbons. I use he, him, his pronouns. I help to run the Socialist Night School. This is the first session of our current semester. I have lost count of what semester it is. I think it might be fifth,
It
David?
is
The fifth.
fifth.
Um, and every semester we like to start with our core programs. What is socialism and what is Marxism? And also sometimes one on social production. Uh, this evening will be What is Socialism? It will be presented by David Kaib. David has been involved in socialist political education in the Washington, D.C. area for, I believe, as long as I've lived in the Washington, D.C. area. Um, and he has been helping to organize the Socialist Night School since it first started. And he's been giving this presentation once a semester for all 5 semesters, and it's quite a joy to watch. David, did I leave out any important biographical information about you?
Oh, that's good.
All right, take it away.
All right. So thank you, everyone. Let's give me 1 second. Okay, there we go. Okay, so tonight our topic is what is socialism? This might be the sort of thing where you might think this should be relatively easy, but I think for a lot of people it's a challenge, and I think that's understandable. There's a great deal of disagreement and confusion on the topic of what is socialism. So we might ask why that is. The first thing I would say is that it's hard. It's legitimately hard. It's hard to see systems. It's hard to think about things that are widely taken for granted. And it's also hard to imagine different worlds, whether they be past or future. That's what this quote from Ursula Le Guin is on the screen here. It says, "We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable, but then so did the divine right of kings." Doesn't mean it's impossible, but it does mean it's hard. Number two is that it's contested. So even within the left. And also there is a tendency, understandably, for us to talk about the things where we disagree rather than the things we agree on. So that makes it difficult if you're new to learn what's going on, because there might be a lot of things that everyone's taking for granted while they fight over things that are important, but are those kind of points of disagreement. We also don't always have common language, and that can be a real challenge as well. And then lastly, there's obfuscation. So especially for those on the top, those people have reasons to prevent us from thinking clearly about these things. They have an interest in making certain things unspeakable. Okay, that's what's illustrated here. We have this picture from the New York Times from the Upshot. It says, "What if all the world's economic woes are part of the same problem?" And as Kate says here, "Congratulations to the New York Times for discovering capitalism." So even when we are talking about it, which often we're not, those in power often prefer not to name it, or to name it and confuse what it is. And so that, again, makes this all a challenge. It may be that if you're newer to socialism, you're not entirely sure what that means. Perhaps you feel like you have a good handle on it, but it's hard to kind of articulate. Or maybe you're older, you've been involved in this for a longer time, but you still want to kind of engage. All of those are fine. Whatever kind of level you're at, we're happy to have you here. And ultimately, we hope we're going to clear some things up and make it so that you're better able to engage these questions and engage the debates within socialism, within the left. Along the way in this presentation, I might specifically mention some authors that you may or may not be familiar with. It's okay if you're not. It's okay if that's not your thing. It's okay if I forget to mention them. It'll all make sense regardless. So to start, I have 2 questions for you. And maybe people can put this in the chat and Chip can read them off for us. And so the 2 questions here, I'm not asking you to actually define these terms. I'm asking you to tell us kind of what you've heard out there, kind of in the discourse when people say these things, kind of in the broader world, what do they mean? What are some of the things that you've heard labeled capitalism? And what are some of the things you've heard labeled socialism? So if you won't mind letting us know in the chat some of your thoughts on this, and maybe Chip can let us know what people have to say.
Yep. If you have an answer to either of these questions, don't be shy. Okay, Allison gives us capitalism equals free market.
That's a good one. Yep.
Dan also gives us capitalism equals free market. Capitalism, owning a business, Curtis tells us.
Yep.
Capitalism, the system, capitalized, of a free democratic society. Socialism, when the government does things. Capitalism is everyone in competition as individuals. Capitalism equals liberty according to the right. Capitalism equals working a job to live. Capitalism equals profit and exploitation. One person just has choice in quotation marks with 4 exclamation marks. I believe they're referring to capitalism, not socialism. I'm not sure which. A guy once remarked to me that socialism is having to share our toilet paper. That's an interesting perspective. The prison industrial system. Another person gave us socialism equals communism, socialism equals sharing, capitalism, private ownership, socialism, community government ownership. Socialism is an aspect of society being run and owned by workers.
Yeah. How about any people? We usually get some people to get these labels. All right. Anything else, Chip, before we
there's a couple more good answers, like socialism is the end to homelessness, hunger, despair. Capitalism is equated with survival of the fittest and the natural order of things. Socialism is authoritarianism when demonized, and socialism equals safety net.
Yeah. So yeah, I think you all have covered a lot of the sort of things you'll hear out there. I mentioned people because oftentimes these terms get equated with individuals. I've heard, people equate capitalism with individual capitalists, someone like Elon Musk. I've heard it. Nancy Pelosi mentioned that she herself was a capitalist, which isn't quite the same thing at one point. Socialism is a label that is used to demonize Democrats who are by no means socialist. I'm thinking of people like Barack Obama or Nancy Pelosi, for example. And those are all important in thinking about the way these things are talked about. And one of the things we might notice is some of the people I think we're getting at kind of where we want to go, which is that many of the answers that people give are not about systems, right? Sometimes they gesture towards something called the mode of production. We'll talk about later, but often that gets left out. But ultimately, what I'm arguing here is that before we can really dig in on what socialism is, we have to ask some other questions. So we lured you in to talk about the one question, but we're going to move backwards. But there's a reason for that. So what are we going to talk about tonight? Before we get to socialism, we're going to talk about feudalism and capitalism. And why are we going to do that? So I'm arguing that to understand socialism, we need to understand capitalism. And then further, to understand capitalism, we really have to have a sense of feudalism, the system that existed before that in certain places. After that, we're going to talk about what socialism and capitalism are not, kind of return to where we are here at the very beginning. Then we're going to talk a little bit about how we get there, because that is important too. And then we'll have question time. So we'll try and leave lots of time for questions, and Chip can yell at me if I'm straggling. And then at the very end, we're going to have talk to you with some ways that you can get connected with the work of the chapter if that's something you would like to do. And I highly recommend it. Okay, so feudalism. One thing to note about the idea of feudalism is this was a term that was invented after the period it was meant to describe. And that period is a historic era in Western Europe around the 9th through the 15th centuries or so. It is an abstraction, right? As are, I will argue, capitalism and socialism. And what I mean by that is that there's core similarities among all the things within those categories, but there's also lots of differences, okay? But one key with feudalism is that it shares with capitalism something very important, even though they're very different systems. And that is that they are both class-based systems. So if you've been taught about feudalism in school, they might have highlighted the relationship between the lower and higher level nobility, right, with kings at the top and so on. What was likely left out or downplayed was working people. So these are the people who produce the necessities of life. Okay. This was incidentally one of the most important initial insights of Marx, the importance of the production of the necessities of life in understanding how a society operates. Okay, and this is what's called the mode of production. It's the dominant way that society is organized to produce goods and services. This is important and will become important again later. So under feudalism, typically, you would have had peasants who were sworn to a lord, working a particular manner that the lord had control over. So they were sworn to a lord connected to the land formally. That lord would have exercised both political, that is coercive power, and also economic and exploitive power. That was all housed in one person or one institution. Households and villages would have produced the vast majority of the necessities of life. And under the system, that list would have been pretty narrow, right? There were not a lot of niceties and luxuries for the vast majority of people. Men, women, children, elderly people, disabled, obviously these categories overlap, all would have worked among those who were in the peasant class, right? Property under feudalism was semi-socialized. So you had commons that were kind of owned by the community. You had which would be common areas, so things like forests where the people might forage and things like that. People had a right to do those sorts of things even if they didn't formally own them, to hunt and to forage, fish. Both the lord and the peasant had a claim to the land being used for the production of food and the basic necessities. So peasants were doing the work, lords are going to get a cut. It might look different in different places, but that was the basic idea. And there's no question under this system that there's which class you're in. You know, you're a peasant or you're a lord. It's a very clear distinction. There's no question that the peasants are working for the lord. They're working to support themselves, but it's very clear that a cut of what they're doing and what they're producing is going to the lord, right? Under this system, there's no compulsion for increased productivity. So there might be some reasons why people might do that. And certainly that was a thing that would happen, finding new ways of doing things. But it wasn't, as we'll see under capitalism, this kind of constant push that one had to increase productivity or one would lose your land. That wasn't how it worked. That sort of competition wasn't part of the system. For the most part, that meant that lords didn't really spend a lot of time telling peasants how to till the land, right? How they did their work was kind of their own business. So there was class struggle, but it might have been over things like who got what plots of land, the days of work versus non-work, those sorts of things. Trade, and therefore markets, surely existed under this system, right? A lot of that would have been for luxury goods, right? There was a lot of trade in that. So the people who were, the small group of people who were living at the top would have had a lot of interest in getting luxury goods and the money or what have you to get them. Ordinary people would not have had the ability to buy much. On a much smaller scale, you would have had people like craftsmen, like a blacksmith. But what most people were doing is they were engaged in subsistence agriculture, where they also produced a mostly non-market surplus that would have supported the military class, the lord class. Cities also existed, but again, most of the people would have been doing this sort of work. Was there conflict? Absolutely. There were peasant revolts, there was shirking, there was running away. Divine authority, which we mentioned before, didn't mean that everyone simply accepted their fate. Also, was this the only system? Absolutely not. Earlier in earlier times and elsewhere in the world, there were systems based on various forms of surplus extraction and capture. It would look like tribute, plunder, taxes, and slavery. And there were some societies that lacked these sort of clear distinctions between worker and non-worker, although that I think was relatively rare. But there were lots of other systems out there, which is important for us to understand. This map, you may be familiar with this Matt Bohr's cartoon. It's just took out a slide here. But the point here is that what we're talking about is a system, right? It's not a choice individually to be part of a system or not. You are enmeshed within it. So it might be possible to change your social or economic position within the system, within limits, but your individual choices don't change that system and don't mean you're not a part of that system. So under feudalism, that might mean a peasant running away to a city where they might ultimately become free from their obligations to a lord. But that didn't change the fact that they were still under the system, right? So here's my picture to illustrate capitalism. So why this picture? Because one of the key things for us to understand is that what capitalism produces is simultaneously tremendous wealth and stuff amid also tremendous deprivation, which is illustrated here. And the key is to understand that these are not separate, that they're part of the same process. It's the same process that produces the deprivation that also produces the great wealth. They are two sides of the same coin. So as I mentioned before, trade and markets, which we might associate with capitalism, were part of feudalism and even pre-feudal life, right? But capitalism is different. It's a new system. And it's often seen, at least by some people, as beginning with a process called enclosure, which is where peasants were thrown off the land. A smaller number of them were hired back to work the land, and many others were kind of left to fend for themselves. So it changed the relationship between the vast majority of people and the people they worked for, and also the land, which was kind of the most important factor of production in a society that's mostly producing the necessities, food, and things like that. At the heart of capitalism is the capitalist mode of production. So this is what I've illustrated here with my lovely picture. But the idea here is that the capitalist mode of production, that, as I mentioned, kind of how goods are produced, is at the core of the system, but the system itself is much broader. So the way I like to think of it is oftentimes the things we think of as the economy are things that are happening within the capitalist mode of production. And capitalism itself is defined largely by this mode of production, but also capitalism is a kind of social totality that encompasses everything. It affects everything. So that's why what we're trying to illustrate here. And what you'll see is when people talk about capitalism, sometimes they might be talking about the entire system, social system, without emphasizing the mode of production. Other people kind of focus on the mode of production and leave out the rest of the system. And I'm arguing that we should do both. We should be able to think about this relationship between these two things, that they are both levels are important. Under capitalism, property, specifically initially in land, but also more broadly, all the means of production, is fully privatized. That is, it's held by a relatively small number of people. Under capitalism, we have two broad classes of people, those who own and those who work, right? By ownership, we're talking about private property, and we should understand that this is about the means of production. It's about wealth. It's not about personal property like your stuff, okay? Having stuff doesn't give you power. Owning land, owning buildings, owning factories, that gives you power. So that's what we're talking about. The other thing is when we say people who work, just to be clear, I'm talking about future workers, say the children, the unemployed, past workers, retired workers, and those who maybe are not employed but still work. So like kind of think prototypically of the like working class housewife who might not be employed outside of the home, but was still working clearly, right? It's all those people when I talk about working people, the working class. Under capitalism, you're producing to, instead of producing to meet one's own needs, which is the way it would have worked before, people were producing commodities. Commodities meaning goods that are intended to be sold for a profit, okay? The necessities we're talking about here can be several different things. We might think of them as biological, things like food and shelter. Social, like a car or a cell phone, which is not strictly necessary, but the way the world is organized, it can be very difficult not to have those things. Or cultural, the sort of things that are required to be a respectable person. And that might seem unimportant, but Failing to get those needs met means often that society doesn't treat you as a full person, which can have very material consequences. So I don't want to suggest that that's kind of purely symbolic. Under capitalism, those without wealth must work for wages to pay for necessary commodities. It's the only way to support yourself. Those that do have wealth still depend on the market. They need the market to increase their wealth. Otherwise, they would ultimately spend it away. And they also have to buy commodities. That's how they get the things they need. So everyone involved is connected to the market. So while we might think of prototypically people that are producing kind of the goods and services we all need, there are other sorts of workers, as we know. They're government workers, they're nonprofit workers. These people still have to work for a wage. They still have to buy commodities, right? So they're not, they are still workers, even though they have a different sort of role. The wage relation is the beating heart of this system, right? And we should understand too that larger numbers of these sort of workers, government, nonprofit workers, are only possible because of the kind of massive increases in productivity that we see under capitalism. It's only when you're producing at really high levels that you can have people doing other sorts of things. And that is true. We've had under capitalism an absolutely astonishing increase in our productive capacities, although it has obviously come with a cost. Under capitalism, the worker appears to be paid for all their work. This is unlike feudalism. But a surplus is still produced. The system couldn't survive without it. What it means is the exploitation is to a certain extent hidden. Lines between classes are obscured under capitalism. They're not formal, right, in the way they might have been under feudalism, which is why there's a lot of confusion. One of the reasons why there's a lot of confusion around what class means and where people fit in it. But exploitation is inherent in the system, right? Under capitalism, capitalists do seek to change how work is done. They try and make it faster, have more division of labor, and decrease the skill of the workers and control over those workers. Ever larger numbers of people are involved, and you'll see increasingly long chains of production. The very system requires constant growth, constant expansion. It compels constant productivity increases. Okay. Why? Well, I mean, the more on that later, but one of the key things is what we're illustrating here. And so this, you'll learn more if you come to see Chip talk about what is Marxism. But this is the classic Marxist formula where money is exchanged for commodities and ultimately for more money. That's really the key to how capitalism works. That's what capitalists are trying to do. They're trying to take the money they have and make more, right? And the system itself requires that too, because everyone is chasing profit. The profits are used to keep the system going. In the moments when we don't have that constant growth, which we are seeing right now, the system can seize up. We're in a recession. And that can mean that production can shut down over certain things, even though those things might be tremendously needed, right? Boom and bust. This is a constituent feature of capitalism. It's something we've seen throughout its entire history. There's been times when it's been able to get mitigated and controlled, but it still has always existed. So many people can be in need of something under capitalism, say food or homes, and lack the access while those things go unused. Food can rot on the vine. This is a thing that was happening recently as workers were unable to pick food. Food was unable to be sold in certain cases. And so you had people going hungry because of the recession while food rotted. Why? Because there was no profit in it, right? Profit is the primary force that moves everything. Under capitalism, as a result, work that meets human needs but produces little or no profit is devalued. So you might think of something like care work. Tremendously important and yet typically very devalued under capitalism, particularly in the United States, as are the people that tend to do that work. So we might think of women, especially women of color. These things are all related. Over time under capitalism, more and more of life is commodified, right? It's not just goods, but also services. Increasingly, say in the United States, you see even a lot more people working to produce services rather than goods. That sort of production has been, not entirely, but a lot of that work has been moved overseas. It's still capitalism, it's still commodities, still selling of a thing in order to make money. The other thing that's important to note is that while the wage relation is very important, exploitation is not just about that. The commodification of needs means that exploitation exists in all sorts of things. So we are exploited as consumers in things like housing and debt, where people with a lot of money can get a good chunk of your wages through interest, through rent, and things like that. So they get you coming and going. I mentioned that under feudalism, the kind of political and economic sides are fused. And that is not the case under capitalism, where we have a relatively clear, not perfectly, but relatively clear distinction split between the economic and the political, where you have capitalists or capitalist firms doing the exploiting and the state doing the coercing. The state also works to protect the system. So there might be times where the state acts to do things that is not in the interest of individual capitalists, but maybe in the interest of capitalism as a whole. The prime example of this is the New Deal, right? Where many of the wealthy people were very angry about the New Deal, not all of them. But by taking those actions, it kept the system afloat. That's important as well. The state enforces property rights, it enforces contracts, and it keeps the masses in line. Okay, workers can be kept in line by a whole host of reasons, whether means. It could be atomization, it can be division. So here we're thinking of things like racism, sexism, and ableism. And by limited horizons, kind of imagining that things can't be better or can only be a little bit better. I'm not suggesting here that racism and so on are only doing those things, but they are important in their role as social control, justifying and supporting the tremendous inequalities that exist under capitalism. So over time, workers who initially had no political rights under capitalism did gain them. That required a great deal of struggle. So this is an important change. The rise of democracy is in many ways that story of how the masses were able to gain those political rights, particularly the right to vote. But we should understand that this sort of political power largely excludes power over the conditions in which those people worked, except on the edges or at a formal level. And it also excludes questions about how society resources, including labor, are deployed. Democracy, to the extent it exists under capitalism, is therefore severely constrained. It is more formal than real. Many important questions are beyond the bounds of democracy and politics under capitalism. So the slide here, what I'm doing is illustrating another cut on understanding capitalism. And so we've talked about the workplace and the importance of the workplace. We've talked about the state, but the home also features as an important element of this story. As I mentioned, under feudalism, the home was kind of a place in which production happened, right? People made things they needed in the home, kind of taking care of their basic needs. Under capitalism, the home primarily becomes a place for the consumption of commodities rather than the production of things. It's also the place where we go to recharge in order to go back to work. Now, you might be thinking, well, I don't leave my house anymore, and mostly neither do I. But for those of us who work in offices, this is disrupted at the moment. And I think if that's you're feeling the way that this actually disrupts the norm of how things normally go. But of course, for lots of workers, they are in fact, and they have all along been still leaving the relative safety of their home to go back to work. So this is still happening. The other thing to note is that capitalism makes use of workers that are produced in the home and of the labor power that is replenished there. And it also makes use of nature, right? There is a confusion sometimes, I think, that under capitalism, labor produces all value. That depends on a particular understanding of value. But the trick is that capitalism requires human beings to work, but it also requires things in nature. It requires natural resources. And it has a tendency to use both of those things up. It creates an incentive to destroy those very things that support it. So on the side of nature, we can think of things like pollution or climate change, for example. So this again gets to this point where you have capital pushing in ways, trying to use these things up for profit. The state sometimes pushes back to try and prevent the system from being disrupted, but that's kind of a constant tension and contradiction. So I mentioned division of labor. It's one of the most important ways in which that radical increase in productivity happened. But there's a division of labor between places as well. So we might think of historically, this was traditionally the industrial core, which would have been Western Europe and then later the United States. These were the places where the bulk of industrial production was happening during the Industrial Revolution and beyond. And then you have the periphery. These are the less places back then where it was less industrialized production or the production of raw materials. That has shifted somewhat. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but the differences over division of labor in place certainly still exist. It also happens at a national level where we might think of Detroit, which used to be a place where there was tremendous increase of capital, new jobs and things like that. And over time, what we've seen is capital flight. It's a place of tremendous poverty and deprivation. And then where you've seen capital increase into other cities like Seattle, right? So it's moving back and forth. Sort of work that's done in different places looks different as well. We think about the so-called Rust Belt and the Sun Belt. That was again about capital moving from places where there was kind of industrial production, older industrial production, into newer places in the South and West. You can see at a local level, like here in DC, where you have neighborhoods that see a lot of money going into them and then money coming out, ones that are poor, ones that are richer. These are all connected. But this also brings us to the larger questions of imperialism, settler colonialism, and slavery. So one of the differences you'll see in the transition to capitalism and the way people talk about that's an important topic for socialists, is whether the transition to capitalism is about a quantitative shift. There was accumulation, people getting a lot of wealth that allowed them to drive the system, or whether it's a shift that begins around the mode of production, in particular the social relations, which is more of a qualitative shift. The way I like to think about it is that the capitalist mode of production transformed these things that already existed. They were very important for how capitalism spread, grew, and sustained. So it's really kind of trying to draw those insights from both of those perspectives. But if we think about what this picture is kind of giving us a little sense of, I just noticed that it says gold diggers in the bottom. That I didn't use this before, and I didn't see that before. But so you have Native people in the Americas largely violently were displaced by European settlers. If you're thinking about what became the north of the United States, they would have been displaced largely by people who became petty farmers, kind of small scale farmers. Often those people were themselves displaced by capitalism in Europe, which is why they were coming. In what became the south of the United States, you're talking about plantation owners. These are people who then imported labor, i.e. enslaved Africans, to work the land that had been previously held by the natives before they were displaced. And so you have people producing, particularly under slavery, that are producing goods that are being sold back to capitalizing Europe, making people wealthy on both ends. So thinking about this relationship, sometimes I think people focus on one end or the other end, but it's really, I would argue, the relationship between those two pieces and the way that they reinforced each other that really drove these dynamics. The expansion of productive capacities under capitalism increases the state's ability to make war, to conquer territory. right? Imperialism increases the scope of both the natural resources and the labor that are exploited and directs them often towards the profit of the capitalists, and secondarily for the meeting of the needs of the European working class. So you might think about goods like sugar and tobacco. These would have been produced by enslaved people to be sold as commodities in Europe and beyond, right? These created new needs, things that people didn't think they needed before, but when they became available, they wanted them and then were willing to pay for them and had money to pay for them. You might have other things like cotton, for example, would be produced by enslaved people to replace things that were people previously produced for themselves. Clothing, for example. In an earlier period, people were producing their own clothing. Under capitalism, it was more likely you would be buying that clothing. So the cotton would be shipped to England, to factories to produce clothing that then people would buy with the wages they had made at their jobs, right? Cotton in particular very much fueled industrial capitalism. Which suggests, again, this important relationship between slavery and industrial capitalism. So this raises questions around race and gender and the relationship between race, gender, and class. This is a complex and it's a contested topic. And each of these would require their own session, and we have some of those coming. We've done some of those before, but they're very important, and I don't want to leave you the impression that they're not. And I think there's some things we can talk about that are important here without getting too deep in. And one of the things I want to suggest is a way to think about some of these things that can be more helpful than some of the typical conversations we have. For example, those that pit race and class against each other as alternative explanations, as alternative kind of monoliths, which I do not find a particularly helpful way of thinking. And so what I'm suggesting is that we can pull apart some of these things and try and look for not sort of on-off switches, these kind of broad categories, but a somewhat deeper understanding. And we can do so by thinking at a couple different levels as we ask these questions about this relationship, for example, between race and class. So the first level is history. So here we might ask, are race and or racism trans-historical, meaning that they have always existed? Or are they historically specific, something that arose in a particular moment? If it's the latter, did they arise within capitalism or did they arise prior, or I suppose after? And if so, what are the key moments in which that happens? That is, when might we point to the moment at which race and racism happened? What was the moment we might point to when capitalism happened? Moments, maybe not the right word, but kind of that point in history. When it comes to theory, we can ask questions like whether, and here I'm talking about like how we understand the connection between these things. Was race and racism necessary to capitalism's rise and reproduction? If it wasn't specifically necessary, did it serve a necessary function, something that could have been served by something else, but it ended up being served by this? And if not, was it still useful towards capitalism? Or were they just two unconnected things that kind of happened independently of each other that didn't affect each other? And then another question we can ask here at the theory level is whether race, along with things like gender and sexual orientation, et cetera, are an identity, while class is a material relation, or are they all identities? Or are they all material relations as well as identities? And then more fundamentally, what do we mean when we use these terms? What do we mean when we say race, racism, and capitalism? With terms that often are used without people defining them or thinking about alternative ways of defining them, which can cause tremendous confusion when people are arguing. And then finally, at the level of politics, do we eradicate racism before we can tackle capitalism? Or must we abolish capitalism before we can tackle racism? Would racism end if it weren't for capitalism? If they should be struggled against at the same time, does one take priority? These are all more complicated ways of digging into these questions. I will tell you very simply that my answers are that I believe that racism is historically specific. It arises around the same time as capitalism, although maybe somewhat prior. that it absolutely serves a necessary function, and that's as far as I'm willing to go, that it is a material relation as well as having an identity component, as is class, and that fundamentally these all have to be struggled around at the same time. My point in bringing all this up is that sometimes people ignore these questions and the way they relate to the history of socialism. And I think that means you get a bad history of socialism. Socialists haven't always had good answers to these questions, but they have been struggling over them for a very long time. And many of the people who were doing it were people that were fighting on these other axes at the same time as well. Yeah. So I mentioned before that capitalism is an abstraction, but also that there were differences over time. So this is a kind of historical treatment. We can think of kind of three broad categories over time of capitalism. Other people might cut the lines in a little different places. They might use different titles. I have used different labels at different times. But these two are abstractions, right? Even if we're looking at this level a little bit lower than capitalism, it's still an abstraction. But it's helpful for us to think about, because to say that a longer period of history is all part of capitalism, we should not confuse that with thinking that there was no change or no even fundamental change. So in this first period, liberal capitalism, or so-called laissez-faire capitalism, the quotations is because that's nonsense. The government never really was hands-off. When it was hands-off largely about letting employers exploit people, not really towards anything else. And even then, it wasn't very long before even the state took at least small steps towards regulating, say, things like child labor, working conditions, and things like that. In large part because in early industrial capitalism, like, people were dying off, and people realized that was going to be a problem for maintaining the system, in a certain maybe sense that was bad. Under liberal capitalism, you still had slavery and colonialism abroad. So obviously, those understand that the state is still doing a lot of things. This is a time, again, when you sort of see manufacturing in the core, the peripheries largely, the work in the peripheries being about providing raw materials to fuel the factories in the core. In the next period, we could call Fordist capitalism or Keynesianism. Sometimes people talk about the welfare state, social democracy, and so on. So you see much stronger efforts by the state to manage the economy here, as well as to provide for a wider array of human needs that weren't being met via work. So that's what the welfare state is about. You see stronger unions. This is true not just in the imperial core, but also in those periphery countries, although it looked very different. But this kind of movement is very similar in both of those places. But we should also understand that you still have, for example, in the United States, things like Jim Crow. We have women's oppression, even though things were maybe getting better in some ways, they weren't. It wasn't always for everyone, and many people were left out. Under the last period, the one we're in currently is neoliberal, or maybe financialized capitalism. Here we see the rise of globalization, of austerity, states' kind of capacity to meet human needs is being weakened. But that doesn't mean the state is necessarily being weakened, because its capacity to surveil, detain, and kill is vastly expanded, as well as its capacity to kind of prop up wealth. There are some people who want to use the term capitalism to only apply to this first period, the laissez-faire so-called period. But this misses a lot, right? That the free market was always a misnomer. The state was always involved. Violence is always involved. And if we are to say, well, that's the only real period of capitalism, then we would just have to have a new term that's abstract enough to cover all these things, because there are still, as we say, tremendous similarities over all these periods. The other thing is, these differences are not just about economics. The first and second periods, or the first and third periods rather, saw big increases in state punitiveness, although it looked differently. in the role of the state. You saw changes in what we might call, what Nancy Fraser calls regimes of care, the way that care work is done and organized being changed, which is sometimes through wage work, but not oftentimes heavily not as well. We see the rise of the nuclear family to some extent in the first era. This is the single wage earner as a normative, or the single wage earner as normative in the second. Under the third period, the expectation is that all people work, something that was always true, at least for those at the bottom, and the commodification of care, right? So this is, again, about economics, but is much broader than that. Okay, so let's talk about socialism. So if feudalism and capitalism were both forms of class society, then I would posit to you that socialism is at its core a class-less society, is a society with no exploitation. But that could take different forms. So just as capitalism and feudalism were forms of a class society, I think socialism is a more abstract notion. And so you can be committed to it, and there could be disagreements about what that might look like. But we can kind of cover some of the basic grounds. The point of production under socialism would be to meet human needs, not to make profit, right? And one of the consequences of that was that we would no longer be devaluing care work, because it clearly is related to human needs, to supporting human needs. Socialism would not require growth and constant expansion. In fact, you might even say, and I would, that it forbids it because of climate change, right? Climate change is obviously a threat to meeting human needs. We would have to, under socialism, find a way to challenge that constant growth imperative. Thankfully, taking away the profit motive would go far towards that. So I would say any socialism has to be an eco-socialism. Democracy would expand to cover work. So there would no longer be this economic and political split. But that democracy would have to be real and substantive, not formal. It would be true collective power over the direction of our lives and our world, over what under capitalism is called investment, about how resources are deployed, including our own labor. This would necessarily entail a change in how work is organized. Work would still be socialized as it is under capitalism, but the direction would be socialized as well. Under capitalism, those who direct the work and those who do the work are different. It's different groups of people. Under socialism, that would no longer be separate. Those who are doing the work would be involved in making those important decisions directly. So I said the abolition of class is kind of, for me, the core notion of socialism. Other terms you may have heard would be collective ownership of the means of production or abolition of private property. I think each of these in their own way gestures towards it, and it's helpful to think about what each one adds. So abolition of class means we have to get rid of exploitation, that we would a tremendous reduction in hierarchy. Collective ownership of the means of production understands the control over the means of production gives one power. And so we need to have that be held by everyone if we truly want to be free. An abolition of private property understands that it is through that ownership that power comes. But again, we have to remember what we mean by private property. We're talking again about the means of production. Another word that people use is liberation, which I wouldn't use that as a definition, but I think it's a really helpful word for us to think about and about what that means. And I think if we think about it in connection to these three things is particularly helpful. So I mentioned that I think socialism has to be eco-socialism. I think it also has to be internationalist. These core periphery distinctions that we mentioned before that are the product of kind of the way that capitalism develops unevenly have tremendous negative consequences, particularly for people in the periphery. So we would have to challenge that. It wouldn't make sense to have people in certain parts of the world who, having organized their societies around providing for the needs of other people and having their own needs going too much unmet. We would, under socialism, strive towards no division, no atomization, and a much broader sense of horizons. I mean, we wouldn't take things for granted. They wouldn't be naturalized. This doesn't mean there's no conflict. It doesn't mean that those things would happen automatically. But this change would open up the possibility for us to work on these sort of things. For some people, socialism would require ending racism, sexism, ableism, and so on. Other people see ending capitalism as a means for creating the conditions that will allow us to end those things. And others would simply see them as parallel projects. And so wherever you come down on this, I would simply say that if our goals are to meet human needs and to give people collective power over their lives, it seems to me there's no way to do that without dismantling racism and so on, right? Would there be markets under socialism? Some people say yes, some people say no. But I think what you wouldn't have is commodities. You wouldn't have production for profit. Profit would definitely not be a thing you could have. Some people think that markets could be used under socialism as a coordinating mechanism to figure out how we deploy resources. Other people have suggested that there's no way to do markets without recreating capitalism. That is maybe a socialism 102 question, but it's important to understand that those options are out there. A lot of the differences among socialists get to different relationships to the state. That too is a really complex question. But I would say that for some people, the idea is that you can seize control over the state and then use it as a means to kind of make the changes in society that we need. Other people see the state as kind of being in the way of that. And other people see states as necessarily hostile to our liberation. There's a whole host of opinions on that. And again, we'll leave that for more deeper conversations. But a lot of the differences among socialists get to this, and they also then relate because strategy differences relate to different views on the state heavily a lot of the time. One of the questions that we've gotten along the way that I will raise and answer is, I gave this talk at University of Maryland, and someone asks, he said, he was in an engineering program and he knew a lot of the people in that program were only in the program because they wanted to make money. They didn't like the work. They didn't like what they were learning. And he said, how would we solve this problem under capitalism? Presumably we'd need engineers, and how would we get people to do it if we weren't paying them a lot of money? And my answer is that we are products of the system we're in. So there's a couple things. Is one, I would imagine that one of the reasons why some of those people didn't like the work is because they had to do the work on behalf of someone else. Someone with money and power gets to decide what's going to be done, and then they had to work on it. They might feel differently if they were involved in making decisions about what needed to be done and what problems were worth solving. The other thing worth remembering is that a lot of people never get the opportunity to learn this sort of thing. They're given poor education. They're not able to afford to go to college and beyond. Some people don't get the possibility of any sort of formal education at all, especially if you're looking at globally. Who knows how many people would be willing to do these things if we opened up those sort of things. But fundamentally, a lot of it boils down to there are many things that we need to do and lots of things that we don't. And so if we free that up, I think that it would help us resort those sort of things. And if we change the nature of work, the sort of things that were interesting and worth doing would change as well. Okay. So I said we're going to talk about what socialism and capitalism are not. This was a user-generated meme. This was not actually produced by the Sanders campaign, but you may have seen variations on this out there. It's entitled Socialist Programs in the United States. And so some of the things you see on here are the CIA, snow removal, the FBI, farm subsidies, dams, public landfills, things like this. A lot of this comes from the confusion that socialism means government and capitalism means business. And hopefully by this point, you can see that I don't think that is true. I don't think it's a particularly helpful way of talking about things. if nothing else, we have perfectly good words for government and business. Those are the words. So why would we need to use these other words to mean those things? We need words to talk about the systems, and capitalism is a system where government plays a really important role. And it's very important that we don't obscure that. Other things I mentioned before, participation in capitalism is not voluntary. There's this confusion that if you buy things, then somehow you can't complain about capitalism. That's not how it works. There's no way not to buy things. You would die if you did not buy commodities. You would likely die, for most of us, if we didn't work eventually. Participation is not voluntary. It's not a choice. As I said, it's a system. Another point of confusion is this idea that socialism is just planning, that if you have some sort of planning or something, sometimes we talk about the dreaded central planning, that's socialism. There's a lot of planning under capitalism. There's a lot of planning that, whether that's oftentimes it's done by corporations or maybe at the industry level. There's a lot of planning under capitalism done, say, by the military. It's not always good. It might be about things like how to deal with climate refugees, which is a good topic in the abstract, but can be very bad when it's the military deciding these sort of things. There's tons of planning. We need planning. Planning is good. But planning is not socialism. Planning could be just as well about planning out how you're going to make money, how you're going to have a profitable industry and things like that. So here we have pictured Ronald Reagan long before he was president of the United States. This was actually a record that was put out by people by Reagan here, where he speaks out against socialized medicine. This was a record that was attacking Medicare when it was being proposed, where business insisted that it was going to be socialism. It was socialism. It was going to bring about socialism and communism. Of course, after a time it won and everyone pretended that it wasn't socialism because that's how it works. They use this to attack things. And then when you win, that all goes down the memory hole and then it gets exempted for some reason. It's important for us to think about the way that has worked, because socialism has been used as an accusation basically against all efforts to challenge exploitation and oppression throughout a really large swath of history, whether it was things like women getting the right to vote, ending slavery, the welfare state, unions, minimum wage, all sorts of things, big and small, have been attacked for being socialism. And these things were not socialism, and they were also good, which also socialism is. Socialists seek systematic transformation, but another source of confusion is that they often are seeking smaller changes in the interim. These changes might mitigate things. They might be what we call non-reformist reforms, those that do not by themselves transform the system, but can move us towards that and create power to change dynamics and things like that. The key thing that separates two people that are proposing this or fighting for the same sort of thing, but does so kind of on behalf of socialism or not, would be the end goal and the analysis, and maybe to a certain extent, like how it's pursued. But that doesn't mean that there can still be overlap, and that means that socialists can at times work with people who aren't socialists and often do. The last thing is, and I mentioned that socialism has been used as an attack of demonization. It's also a thing that sometimes people would apply to themselves that maybe is not warranted, whether it be individuals, there might be countries and things like that. My point is simply that the claim alone is not the reality, and so we should look at it, but try and look beyond that. The other thing that I think creates a source of confusion here, and this relates to all these things we've just been talking about, are hypocrisy arguments. And I would recommend that you beware hypocrisy arguments. You see this often among liberals, where they tell conservatives that they're actually pro-socialist because they support, government programs of some sort, or financial bailouts or things like that. I think the vast majority of the people this is being directed to understand that those things are, they understand that that's not really what they're talking about. They might use the socialism attack more broadly than they necessarily mean it. I think it's really important for us to be clear in our own minds about what socialism and capitalism are, and these sort of gotcha arguments run the risk that we obscure that. All right. It is important also to note that even public ownership alone does not equate with socialism. So you can have, state-run industry, but if it's basically the government controlling that and the people don't have control, then that's not even a step towards socialism, right? The key, as I mentioned before, is whether ordinary people have that sort of power. And so formal ownership alone does not settle that question. Relatedly, we might ask, who is a capitalist and who is a socialist? So a capitalist is a person who has capital. There's a position within a social relation. It is not a person who ideologically supports capitalism. That's probably better, we might say pro-capitalist for that sort of thing, although that distinction is generally obscured. So oftentimes people talk as though capitalism is simply an idea. And so if I'm capitalist, it means I believe in capitalism, but it's not. Capitalism is about this, the material reality of the world and your position in it. That's why this distinction is important. The other thing I would say is that a socialist is not merely someone who ideologically opposes capitalism, but it's someone who participates in the collective struggle to bring it about. That can mean all sorts of things. There are many ways to participate in that struggle. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be doing big heroic things. Sometimes the really small things can help move things forward. But it does mean, I would argue, to be a socialist, you have to actually participate in that struggle. It's not just an idea. So let's apply what we've been talking about. So this is from the DSA website, and explains how DSA defines democratic socialism. So I'm going to read it here for you. You can read along. It says, democratic socialists believe that both the economy and society should be run democratically, to meet public needs, not to make profits for a few. To achieve a more just society, many structures of our government and our economy must be radically transformed through greater economic and social democracy, so that ordinary Americans can participate in many decisions that affect our lives. So I'm going to highlight a couple of those things in here, the things we talked about, right? So extending democracy throughout the entirety of the economy and society, meeting public needs, not making profits, changing structures, radical transformation, and ordinary Americans participating. The literal definition of democracy was demos, is rule by the people, and the implication of that initially in Greece was rule by the working people. It's literally what democracy means, because in almost all societies, working people are the vast majority of people. All right. If you had true democracy, that's what it would mean. And so that's what we're talking about. It has many implications. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about how we'll get there. These are some examples, right? And these are kind of beginning steps, but they're helpful, I think, for thinking about through this stuff. There's some overlap between these sorts of things. Sometimes there's even some tension, but I think properly understood, they are all mutually reinforcing. So at the top, we have labor organizing. Might ask, why would the workplace be so important for socialists? We know that it's a site of exploitation. It's also a place where we come together and where collectively we have some power, we have leverage. Collectively we do, even if individually we don't. So that's important. For protests, oftentimes we're thinking about targeting government, but it could also be targeting business. Here you're talking about seeking to compel concessions. I think it's an important way to think about it. Compelling concessions, not about necessarily convincing anyone of anything. That's not the point. It's raising costs to do things, to force people to do what you need. Direct action is related, but I think it's an important distinction that I would make. These are actions that seek to use our power directly to reach our goals rather than by appeals to other actors. So you might think of things like sit-ins, blockades, or occupations. or stopping evictions. So during the Depression, the New York City communists would, when there was going to be an eviction, which there was a lot of during the Depression, they might go and just block the people from doing it, from being able to get in. If they did get in and all the person's stuff would be put on the sidewalk, they would come back and put all the stuff back and make it impossible for the eviction to happen. We've seen that today. I saw a video today of people blocking the courthouse door, preventing evictions from happening. Evictions are always pretty bad for the people being evicted, but they're particularly bad in the middle of a pandemic and recession. So simply by not letting people into the court, that will stop the evictions, right? It doesn't require the people in the court to do anything. They just can't do it. There was also the blockades of ICE from a little while back, where people were blocking the entrances so that people couldn't leave the ICE facility or enter. And that mucked up the capacity for ICE to do deportations, right? These are all examples of direct action. So mutual aid, we're talking about people providing each other with material support directly, right? With the sort of resources they already have. So I might think of things like there was, after Hurricane Harvey in Texas, there were people in DSA that did cleanup, where you had people whose homes were destroyed or damaged as a result of the hurricane. They weren't getting much help from the government, so people went in and helped them clean up so they could return to their homes. There's things like brake light clinics, where people help fix people's brake lights so that cops have one less excuse to pull them over, less likely that will lead in a bad place. Historically, we might think of things like the Black Panthers Free Breakfast Program, right? Obviously, this can sound a little like charity, which is somewhat different, but I think the line between this and charity is not about the specifics of the thing you do, but kind of how you approach the work. Political education, things like this, or I think we're going to be able to talk with some of the other political education that's happening, which doesn't only happen through night school, but also happens in some of the other campaigns and working groups in the chapter. And then electoral work, not putting it last because it's less important, but last because too often our views of politics are so centered into electoral work that we miss all these other things that are important. And electoral work can do a whole bunch of things. It can wring concessions from the state. It can make it more conducive to winning concessions. It can reduce state efforts to go after movements. Electoral work can also expose people to ideas about socialism and capitalism and to the ideas that challenge it. They can make people, we hope to win these sort of races, but even sometimes when we lose, it can bring more people into the fight. And all of those things have the potential to bring in new people, right? They all also require massive increases in scale if we're going to actually move further towards socialism. They all require us to move beyond mitigation to social transformation. This is all about power, and it's about collective struggle, right? Which does not mean a simple electoral majority, but it does mean larger numbers of people actively struggling collectively. I say that because there is sometimes a misconception that if just 50% plus one of people in the country want something, that it will happen. There's absolutely no evidence for that. Passive public opinion has almost no impact on our politics. Collective struggle does. And that's what this quote is about here from Aruza, Bhattacharya, and Fraser, where they say, struggle is an opportunity in a school. It can transform those who participate in it, challenging our prior self-understandings and reshaping our view of the world. Struggle can deepen our comprehension of our own oppression, what causes it, who benefits, what must be done to overcome it. And further, it can prompt us to reinterpret our interests, reframe our hopes, and expand our sense of what is possible. Finally, the experience of struggle can also induce us to rethink who should count as an ally and who an enemy. It can broaden the circle of solidarity among the oppressed and sharpen our antagonism to our oppressors. And the line that follows here, which is very important, is that the operative word here is can. We're not talking about things happening automatically. We're talking about possibility. This quote here is from the organizer, Mariam Kaba. We're one slide away from being done. I don't remember the original context, but I can tell you that I come back to it repeatedly and that I've been thinking about it a lot recently. I said before that to be a socialist means engaging in collective struggle. And the way this works is that when we lose, we still have to fight. When we win, we fight. And when we don't know what's going on, we still fight. We have to do that because we know we have a world to win, not just a country to reform. And given the state of the world right now, a lot of people may be open to this notion that maybe wouldn't have been a short time ago. So it's on us to work towards constantly letting this radicalize us rather than leading us to despair. I understand that's work. That's okay, but it's something to strive for. So we have a list of some additional readings that if you're interested, we're going to share. We're going to have this up on the website. These first two pieces, the Wallerstein and Wood, are both on this question of the transition of capitalism. They take very different approaches. I find them both helpful. Wallerstein in particular wants us to focus on the role of imperialism. Wood also talks of imperialism, but in particular is interested in this change in the mode of production and social relations happening in a particular place at a particular time. Both of them, I think, are pretty readable and useful. Olin Wright is a very different take on socialism and capitalism than mine, but it's a very, I think, helpful way of thinking about things, even if you disagree. And he's some clear thinking on how to get there, again, where I agree and where I don't. The Assad Haider piece is a warning not to get too bogged down into what socialists think, like the content, but rather to ask about how they think and to understand the differences within us, which we've tried to do a little bit here today. And then the last three pieces are about how capitalism relates to oppressions beyond class. Davis's is a really good treatment of the different forms of oppression and exploitation relate historically. Aruza, Bhattacharya, and Fraser, who I was just quoting from a minute ago, are focusing on the idea of social reproduction, which is the connection between the capitalist mode of production and gender oppression. And then Russell and Malorda discuss the roots of the notion of disability within capitalism. All of those, I think, are particularly helpful and good places to go if you want to dig in a little bit more. And so I believe we already have some questions, but that's where I will stop and I'll turn it over to Chip.
Thank you, David. This is the fifth time I've seen this presentation, and every time I am completely and totally engaged and enthralled by it. I believe there are several new pieces this time. I'm always excited to see what you've added. All right, so if you have a question, please put it in the question and answer box, and I will ask it of David. So David, our first question comes from an anonymous attendee. I grew up in a very rural red area and was told that socialism meant you can't own your own house or your own business. Do you have any reading or tips for people who grew up viewing socialism only as a scare term?
Yeah, it's a good question. A lot of people can't own their business now or own a house now, right? It depends on where you are. Certainly in DC, for example, those things can seem really impossible for most people. What you have under capitalism is not that this is broadly available, but that it's available to some people, right? So the question, I think, is, for me, less about whether you should get your own, but rather you should have a sort of ownership stake over those sort of things, particularly your work. Why shouldn't the people that do the work get to make decisions about how the work is done? That is ultimately what we're talking about. And so the only thing left of ownership after you take that away is the ability to exploit, which I'm not particularly interested in protecting. But I think that that's a big piece of it, is that sense that under capitalism, you can lose your home. Under capitalism, you may be barred from having a business. But under socialism, everyone's going to have their need for housing met. Everyone will be able to work. So we won't have unemployment, which is a line for jobs, right? Which is weird. We have some people that have too much work and some people that don't have enough work. It's a fun thing of capitalism. Under socialism, we would all be able to contribute and we would all be able to get there, but we wouldn't have bosses. And I got to tell you that I think not having a boss is a particularly good thing to talk with people about, because I think most people who have had a boss, it might be difficult to imagine a world without them, but they usually get why that would be a nice world.
Okay, the next question is from Sophie. She loves to talk. Isn't social democracy distinct from democratic socialism? In reference to the definition of democratic socialism for DSA. Second question, although he popularized democratic socialism, isn't Bernie Sanders actually a social democrat?
So this is a good question. So social democracy, which we should probably do a whole event on that, is a term that changed over time. So the original social democrats were kind of a broad umbrella term that included people who wanted to reform capitalism as well as other sorts of radicals. So many of the people that we think today from back then as being kind of against social democracy were actually part of social democratic parties. And then ultimately there were splits and things like that. The particular thing that led to a lot of those splits was World War I, where many radicals, I think rightly, saw that as the boss's war. And unfortunately, the kind of reformers types tended to support the wars. So that's important history, but it doesn't really answer the question. Typically, the way that we think of it today is that a social democrat is someone who is seeking to radically reform capitalism, but still leave it in place, is the way I would put it. So you would have strong unions, you would have a strong welfare state, strong regulations, you might have unions and business kind of coming together to make decisions and things like that. A lot of different things. We're often the place we think of this most is kind of the Nordic countries, but while simultaneously leaving capitalism intact, right? And so my argument is that will ultimately fail. That what you're saying is we're going to still have this group of people we're going to call capitalists, and they're still going to have all the same incentives they always had, but we're going to keep them in line. That we will. So the line you sometimes hear is talking about unfettered capitalism is the problem. And so my point is I don't think that you can sustainably fetter capitalism, right? You can over time for particular periods and particular places, but ultimately capitalism is unfetterable, that it always is has this drive towards breaking those chains, and it has power that allows it to succeed. So that's kind of the way I would make that distinction. Democratic socialists, as I understand it, means that we are committed to ending capitalism. And so that means we are not social democrats, although they might be our friends. In terms of Bernie's, I think my argument would be that the definition of socialism that Bernie has offered has largely been probably better termed social democracy. Is Bernie then a social democrat? I don't know that, because I don't know ultimately what he's committed to. I think if you look his history, he certainly had a long history of being committed to something a lot broader. And so my inclination, I don't know, is to say that his ultimate goals are much broader, but that he seemed to be very concerned with trying not to scare people off. That socialism isn't scary. I understand that. It's a challenge. I tend to think that the way we do that, I'm also not running for president or a senator, that the way we do that is we talk with people about what we mean by it and what why we're for it, those sorts of things. We kind of treat it as an organizing conversation, and that will tend to work. It's not going to work with everyone, but that's okay. There's a lot of people who are not committed to capitalism so much as they take it for granted. And I think those people can be moved. I'm not so worried about moving the ideologues. I gave you kind of an answer to the first question, and ultimately I'm not sure to the second.
So this question got upvoted, so I'm going to ask it. In terms of politics and economics, how does the notion of liberal as opposed to neoliberal fit into this discussion, if it fits in at all?
So a couple different ways. One is we might think of liberal being the way we describe the kind of first phase of capitalism, where government was relatively hands-off in regulating business, where there was no sense that government was obliged to meet people's needs, that could be met through the market. And that neoliberal then is you have the period in between, which is different. But then you have this later period of neoliberal period where once again, the notion is increasingly that the government isn't responsible for meeting our needs, that the market will do that. It's in a very different way. So in the past, it would have been most of us as workers. Today, under neoliberalism, I think the notion is sort of we're all supposed to be entrepreneurs, even if we're wage laborers. So I think of the Uber commercials where it's like everyone has to have a side hustle. So the guy's going back and forth between the couch and doing his Uber and like hanging out with friends and doing his Uber. But the hustle is this idea that you're supposed to be constantly engaging with that work. And in particular, it might be work that doesn't look like most work for most people. So I think that's one notion there. The other thing is that we might think of them in political terms. So here, there's a tradition of liberalism, which looks a lot different than laissez-faire capitalism, at least in the United States. We're talking about the tradition of the New Deal, of the Great Society, of people like Ted Kennedy in the United States. This looks a lot like social democracy, but it's kind of an American version that's stunted, at least in part, by, say, Jim Crow and the history of racism in the history and current racism in the United States. Whereas the neoliberals were a group of people that were pushing back on that. They were ultimately competing for control over the Democratic Party, also other parties as well. But so here we could think of Medicare. The original Medicare is, I think, a pretty typical liberal solution to a problem. It was a government program that was going to meet people's need for insurance if they were elderly. The ACA is more of a neoliberal solution to that, which we're going to find markets it's not just markets, but it's also government actively shaping the markets to try and solve that problem. So I think this is part of the confusion because these words mean a couple different things depending on like what level we're talking.
So multiple people have asked some version of this question. One person asked, at a high level, what distinguishes socialism and communism? And someone else asked, what is the line between socialism and communism? I know this is a question you get a lot, David, so take it away.
I think I intended to say it, but I didn't. So as many things, this is one of those things that's contested. And so that's a challenge. I will give you my answer, and I will also tell you some of the other answers that people provide. My answer is this. Marx, for example, used at times these words to mean different things, and at other times he used them somewhat interchangeably. I tend to think of socialism as the kind of broadest umbrella for these sort of things. And that's one of the reasons why I use it. I don't use it to try and distinguish myself from communists or people that identify as communists. If I know that someone has identified themselves as a socialist versus a communist, I don't necessarily know what that means until I get a chance to talk with them. And if I use those labels, people will do the same. There are sometimes people will assume they know the answer, but I don't think you can unless you actually talk with someone. So for me, I don't really see much of a distinction for the way I think about it, although I respect other people's, use to want to use the different labels. On the other hand, there's one version of this story goes, and this also you can find in Marx, is that there's sort of a two-level process, it's sort of a stage. So that socialism is the first stage we get out of capitalism, where the state, with the workers kind of in power, is going to be under control, is going to try and transform the social relations, meet people's needs, and so on. And that after a certain period of time, you will be able then to shift to the next system, which is communism, where the state withers away. We could talk a whole long conversation about what that means, but I think I'll leave that for Chip when he talks about Marxism. And that would look even different. Oftentimes when people talk in those terms, you might say that under socialism, the working class will rule, And again, that's almost the vast majority of people. Whereas by communism, you have the abolition of class. It's obviously different than the way I presented it. I don't tend to think in terms of the stages, which doesn't mean it's not a process. It is, but I don't kind of see that as a helpful way of thinking through. But that is often a distinction that people are making. And then the last piece is that oftentimes when people use the word communism, it's because they are a member of a party that is itself explicitly communist, and that's the designation they're making. Oftentimes these are smaller organizations, tend to be more like what we call cadre organizations. You couldn't just join because you want to, for example, which is the way DSA works, which is a lot more open-ended. So for me, I don't put a lot of stock into worrying about these sort of distinctions, but I know for other people they're important. So I try and respect them without me going into it too much.
There's also in the 20th century, just as a colloquialism, just communism came to be sort of synonymous with the Soviet system or the Chinese system or the Cuban system, even though those systems describe themselves as socialist. So communism became sort of in sort of mainstream parlance synonymous with either the Soviets or the Chinese, and people who supported those systems.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Time. Yeah. I think that's how it usually is used in the 20th century post World War II.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for the great presentation. Can you talk about what a workplace would look like in a truly socialist system and how that differs from our current arrangement?
So one of the challenges with these sort of things is that we don't have, it's not as though there's a book that says this is how you do it, right? This is things, I mean, people have talked about these things, they've written about these things, but ultimately it's something, and this I think is a helpful way of thinking about it, that it's helpful for us to think about how we would like to solve these problems together, right? Which isn't to mean I'm not going to give you an answer, but that's kind of the way I would approach this. And so the way I would think about it is that I have no difficulty imagining that under socialism and workplace, we would have someone who does the direction of the work, kind of a manager, that sort of thing. What I think would look different was how those people would be chosen. So right now, you can be fired by your boss. I think we need to switch it up. You should be able to fire your boss, or you and your coworkers should be able to fire your boss. They should probably be someone who does the same sort of work, who we're saying, all right, you are going to take on this task and, play this role. But if we collectively don't like the way you're doing it, then you're going to lose that power. That's a tremendous shift in power in the way things will work from Mars. But the other thing I mentioned was, I think what we have now, as I said, is the separation between direction and execution, that there are certain people that make decisions about what has to happen and other people who are supposed to carry it out. Many of us are in workplaces where there is a symbolic level of collaboration, but there's no question who has the power. And a lot of times those collaborations seem much more about getting you on board with what the powerful people want to do than actually making any decisions. So fundamentally, it would be about making those decisions. So I can give you an example. I remember reading a book about people who worked in hotels, was the hotel workers, and how their frustration that many of them working in these places, they knew how they worked, they knew the people who came and what they needed, and the people who were in charge didn't, right? They weren't typically doing the work. They weren't typically interacting with the customers in the same way that these other workers were. And they had a real sense that they knew how to solve particular problems or how to do things better, and that the people in charge were not interested in. Like, why is that? Why would not the people doing that work be able to be involved in making those sorts of decisions? So to me, those are the kind of the two big things. It's both the ability to fire your boss and the idea that many decisions will be made collectively by the workers rather than someone over top of them.
Okay. So where does national security slash international relations fit into socialism, such as with Iran, Israel, China, or Russia, or terrorism, etc.?
Is that all? Okay. So, number one, I think as a person living in the United States, um, the greatest threat to me is my own government. I think that is generally true, but it is really true under the current administration. Um, you know, I am much more concerned about the failure to handle the problems of the pandemic and the recession and the rise of white power groups and police violence against protesters and things like that. These are all pretty serious threats. Some of them directly to me, some of them indirectly. I'm not particularly worried about the threat of most of these other countries. Sometimes it's because they are rather small and relatively powerless. The United States continues to be the most powerful military nation in the world by a lot, and to spend way more on military than any of the other alleged threats. Terrorism, I think, is often best understood as blowback to American actions. That's not a moral statement. I think it's just a factual statement. The United States government does all sorts of things. Oftentimes those things are hidden from the public, but they're not hidden from the people that are being droned, that are being occupied and things like that. And that tends to produce the conditions in which people want to come and hurt us. I think there's an easy solution for that. I think when it comes to China, for example, the two ways it's presented as a threat is one, military, and I don't think that's true. We have a global empire that kind of dwarfs their presence on the globe, and does many bad things, our empire. And then also the other way it's presented as a threat is a threat economically. But the reality is that it wasn't that China competed with the United States, and that's why jobs went there. It was that American companies wanted to be able to produce for much more cheaply so they could make more money, and they produced in those places. So those threats seem to be, again, not China, but they're internal. Fundamentally, as I think most socialists are concerned with international cooperation, with reducing war, with reducing the American empire, and seeing that those things will be more likely to bring about peace and security for Americans and for everyone else who also are human beings. How that plays out in particular instances is a much broader question. And it's something we've talked about in some other night schools, for example, in our night school on the US use of sanctions as a weapon of war.
So we have another question that's sort of along the vein of the social democracy and communism question, which is, what is the difference between socialism and democratic socialism?
Okay. Again, this is contested, and I'm going to give you my answer. And my answer is that democratic socialism, it generally means, well, currently, it generally means someone who's a member of DSA. DSA is a multi-tendency organization. So there are people that, what that means is there are people that kind of have very different ideas of what socialism is that are part of it. There are plenty of people who identify as communist and other things as well. Some people explicitly don't use the democratic, they just say socialist, which is where I tend to, you'll notice. So that's one. The other element is historically. And so people began using the word democratic socialism. This kind of gets back to something Chip was talking about in, say, the United States and in Western Europe in particular, at a time when to distinguish themselves from kind of USR style communism, particularly at a point when some of the atrocities that happened under Stalin were made public. So this was people, I think, who understood for the most part that socialism required that it was always democratic, and that the people who claimed the mantle who weren't democratic were not themselves socialist, but they used that word as a way of distinguishing them. There are other people who would argue that the term today means something more specific. That's not the position I take. I'm not convinced that there's a consistency in the way people use it. To me, the biggest thing it tells me is that someone is either in DSA or kind of in that orbit of politics. But that is, my opinion, not kind of general opinion.
Yeah, and there are definitely people who think that democratic socialism is distinctive from socialism. I personally share David's perspective, but I'm putting some links in the chat to some Jacobin articles that reject David's perspective.
Thank you. Sure.
Because there are a lot of people in DSA who do feel that it's a distinctive form of socialism. And historically in DSA over the long run, I would say that was a more commonly held position than it is currently. The only other thing I would add is that sometimes democratic socialism is used to denote sort of a parliamentary road to socialism as opposed to a more revolutionary one. So like parties within liberal democracies that participate in and contest in elections.
Agreed.
So in that case, Bernie Sanders would, DSA's work around Bernie Sanders would fall into that definition, as would like Salvador Allende in Chile or like Tony Benn in the UK. I know it'll require a different session, but just as food for thought, what's an example of a question that lies outside the bounds of democracy under capitalism?
So what I mean by that is, and the best example I could give is the ways that very wealthy people, because they have wealth under capitalism, are able to make decisions about the way society's resources are deployed. So there are a couple of different billionaires who have been spending a great deal of money, which is also, resources and also labor, intellectual work, all that sort of thing, to try and get to Mars, right? Billionaires seem to be obsessed with going to Mars. And one might say that that's not a particularly good use of our resources, that we have a lot of problems here and it would be better to try and solve them. Under capitalism, we could maybe tax some of that money. We could maybe change things so that the flow of money going to those people is less than it is now. Certainly historically, those have been things that have happened. But still, people with a lot of money would get to make a lot of those important decisions simply by the fact of having money. Money under capitalism gives you power, and it gives you power over other people. So that's the thing I'm talking about, is that, again, it doesn't mean that we don't have the state and democracy doesn't have any control over it, but it tends to on the edges, and that there's a lot of things people can do. And we might say, oh, it's private. But is it private to be taking massive amounts of our resources and be using it in either useless or even socially destructive ways? I would argue that it's not.
And just a brief update, I have put 3 separate articles from 3 separate people, all from Jacobin, defining democratic socialism as a distinctive political tendency, because I do want to clarify that it's a valid point of view and one that many people share. It's not David or I's point of view, but that doesn't make it invalid, and it's worth thinking about why people who feel that way.
There are other ways, if you disagree with it, is invalid, but this isn't one of them.
Yes, thank you, David. Why is it that so many dispossessed workers are so committed to capitalism?
So this is a good question. On the one hand, I think there are 2 types of people. I think there are people who just take it for granted. And they can appear committed to it, but really what it means is they don't even see it, or they can't imagine a world beyond it. But I take you to mean the people who are truly committed to it. And I think one of the things that happens under capitalism, and in particular under neoliberal capitalism, is that people are told that they are themselves responsible for their lot in life. And this is a message that's pounded into us from a very early age throughout your entire life. We have this sense that people with wealth and power must deserve it, even when they inherit it, even when they use it poorly. And we also have the sense that even when, today, where you have lots of people thrown out of work, clearly not their fault. It's because of the pandemic and because of the choices the government is making. And there's still the sense that like maybe they deserve it, right? I don't think that that's true, but I think that that's something that's kind of hammered into us from an early age and throughout our lives. So what happens, I think, is that a lot of people say, okay, if it is under my control, then I just have to work harder. I just have to hustle harder and I can just constantly do it. And then the other thing is that there are people who kind of, win the lottery in that way. Obviously, some people actually win the lottery, but I'm talking about someone who comes from very little and basically gets lucky. That is a thing that happens. And so it's easy, I think, for people to think, well, if it happened for that person, then it could have happened for me. And especially if the notion is that your willingness to work and hustle prove that you deserve it. That really creates an incentive to do it all the more. And there's no limit, right? Let's say there's not a lot of limit. Obviously, like at a certain point you have to sleep, but like you can always maybe press a little harder, work a little harder, learn a new skill, start a new thing. I've certainly met these people that like are trying to make it and they've got, multiple things they're working on at any time. It's an impressive, I wish I could redirect that sort of energy and the organizational skill and excitement into other things, but it is an impressive thing. But I think part of that is a sort of an attempt at proving to oneself and to the world that you actually deserve the good things that you want. And my ultimate answer to this is that we all deserve it, that you can't earn housing, you can't earn healthcare, you can't earn an education. You should get it by virtue of being a human being. It shouldn't be the sort of thing that we treat as a thing you have to earn. But that is not the way things are organized, and it's not the way that like very few people in our politics are talking in those terms. Even if you think about like healthcare, how often there's a shift from many people from this idea like, oh, everyone deserves healthcare. First of all, we say deserve, but also this idea that, because it serves some other functions, like, the costs are too high, or it's going to make us maybe compete with China, as opposed to simply saying everyone deserves it, or everyone should get it. You're a human being, you should get it. And I think if that was more part of our politics, that maybe there would be less of that. If people's basic needs were being met, I think there would be less of that. But fundamentally, I also think that if you want to move us towards socialism, if you want to bring people into the movement, you focus less on the people who are truly ideologically committed to capitalism, your true opponents, and you focus on the vast majority of people who don't really think too much about it. Or if they do, they're pretty cynical, because those are the people we can talk with about, hey, like, let's think about it and let's think about how things could be better. Let's think about what we can do collectively to change it. Those sort of things can be very powerful. And so I think it's important that we focus our attention there instead of moving the people who are most committed against us.
David, how are you feeling about time?
I think, let's see, I want to do one more question.
Yeah.
It is your call. What you want to do?
No, it's your call. You're the presenter. Is there a particular one of these questions you really want to take, David?
I have not had a chance to look at them, so.
Okay.
Dealer's choice. Go ahead.
Do you think there are stronger indirect ways to starve capitalism, for example, by seriously damaging the profit-making ability through collective struggle, getting the government to force capitalists into taking on the true cost of natural resources they exploit, rather than continuing to leave the public to absorb the cost of negative externalities?
Yeah, this raises a really interesting point that under capitalism, capitalists are able to kind of offload a tremendous amount of the costs onto other people and onto society at large in a whole host of ways. And I think ecologically, it's a really important one, and allows them to make tremendous profit as a result of that. that it would be difficult for them to do if it weren't for that. Similarly, I always think about, and this relates to an earlier question, the oil companies do not have to maintain naval superiority in the Persian Gulf in order to sell oil. The US government does that for them. They don't pay for it. And yet that's kind of part of the cost. You don't pay for that when you fill up your car with gas, but you do pay for it, both in financial ways and others. I'm not convinced that it's possible on a kind of broad scale to do that as you suggested. I think that one of the ways we've seen people kind of do something similar is efforts both in the United States and abroad. In the United States, it's often been very led by Native Americans, but in other places where people have basically tried to stop the pipelines, try and blockades, these sort of things, whether it be, sometimes it means stopping the movement of oil tankers. It could be stopping, fracking from happening. I think that there's a lot people can do on the ground in that way if you're in a particular place. That certainly can raise the cost, although again, it's a question of scale. But any efforts we can do to force those costs back on are helpful. The one I always think about is that if I remember correctly, the state of Pennsylvania is the only one that doesn't charge fracking companies for the right to frack. So they're able to just do it for free, even on state land. In other places, they have to pay a fee. That's ridiculous. The state of Pennsylvania ought to push back on that. I don't know if that alone will have what that impact will be, but it seems like a worthwhile endeavor. It seems like a worthwhile endeavor in part because we can contest this notion that those companies are actually paying for their own costs when they're not. It's almost guaranteed that they're not.
Right. Thank you to everyone who joined us. I believe a representative from the Socialist Feminist Working Group is going to make an announcement.
Hi, yes, this is Ursula. Thank you, David, for that great presentation. I've learned so much. The Socialist Feminist Caucus has a reading group. We meet on the fourth Sunday of the month at 2 p.m. And this month, our reading will focus on poetry that highlights on gender, race, class, and labor. The reading group is small. It's a political educational space where the group exchanges ideas, viewpoints, and we educate one another. So far, we've been focusing on BIPOC feminist writers. You can find more information about our reading event on Meetup or Facebook. And I can also post here some ways that the audience can connect with us, the attendees can connect with us, if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay. So let's see. But if you have any questions, you can email us and I'll just put that information right away.
All right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So thank you for that. For people who are interested in learning more about the Socialist Night School, you can visit mdcdsa.org/night school. There are videos of past presentations. There will probably be a video of this presentation. You can follow us on Twitter at nightschool_DC. And you can email us at politicaleducation@mdcdsa.org. And both the Twitter link and the email link are on the MDC DSA website. If you go to get involved and click on Night School, it takes you there. The URL is also mdcdsa.org/night school. So many easy ways to find us. And our next session is going to be on October the 27th. It is What is Marxism? So sort of building off this session as an introductory one for information that maybe people who are new to socialism are curious about. And like this one, it presumes no prior knowledge. It's going to try to be as light on jargon as possible. It's not going to get into weird, intense Marx debate. Just give a broad overview of what someone who is new to the socialist movement should know about Marxism and why socialists care about it. It's not a polemical presentation, just a factual one. And that is on October the 27th. Per our Facebook, that is from 7:30 to 9:30. which surprised me because these are usually from 6:30 to 8:30, and I am not sure if that is an error or if we have been moved. So double check that. David, anything else we need to announce before we log off?
Yeah, if you're not a member of DSA and
Oh,
you'd
yeah.
like to
Join DSA.
join DSA, there's a couple links in there. Curtis has been wonderfully shameless and continuing to put his link in there. So we should support that. Feel free to do that. If one wants to get on the Slack, is there someone on the chat that can answer that question?
I can, yeah.
Okay, go for it.
So you'll just want to send an email to info@mdcdsa.org. Yes, thank you, Curtis. It's in the chat now, info@mdcdsa.org.
Great.
Lots of links in the chat.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
You too.